Every year, around 40,000 people in this country suffer a cardiac arrest outside a hospital, and fewer than 1 in 10 of them survive. That survival rate can climb as high as 70% if someone nearby knows exactly what to do in the first few minutes. For the first time ever, the driving theory test now checks whether you're one of those people, and if you're anywhere near booking your test, this is genuinely worth understanding properly rather than skimming past as a minor update. The DVSA confirmed this change is now built into the car and motorcycle theory test, adding enhanced content on cardiopulmonary resuscitation and, for the first time in the test's history, questions specifically covering how to use an automated external defibrillator. This isn't a small tweak buried somewhere in the existing hazard perception section either. It's a genuine expansion of what the test now expects every learner to know before they're handed a license. The DVSA's own chief driving examiner has been direct about the reasoning, framing it as part of what it actually means to be a safe, responsible driver, knowing what to do in an emergency, not just how to parallel park or read a road sign. Here's why drivers specifically are the focus of this change, rather than the general public through some other education campaign. Roughly 2.4 million theory tests are sat every single year in this country, which makes the test one of the largest structured opportunities the DVSA has to reach a genuinely enormous number of people with life-saving information in a single, consistent format. Drivers are also disproportionately likely to be first on the scene of a roadside medical emergency, whether that's a collision, someone collapsing near a lay-by, or a cardiac arrest happening in a car park or petrol station forecourt. The logic behind folding this into the theory test specifically is straightforward. If you're going to be the person most likely to encounter this situation, you should walk away from earning your license actually knowing what to do, rather than hoping you'd remember something from school years earlier. Let's talk about what's actually different if you're booking your test now, because the practical changes are genuinely minimal, despite how significant the underlying content shift sounds. The test itself hasn't gotten longer, it hasn't gotten more expensive, and the overall pass mark hasn't moved. The new CPR and AED questions are simply folded into the existing 50-question multiple-choice section, alongside everything else you're already expected to know. If you were already comfortable with the structure and format of the theory test before this change, nothing about how the test actually runs has shifted. It's purely the content bank underneath it that's expanded. Now let's get into what you actually need to know, because this is genuinely useful information regardless of whether you're studying for a test or you passed your test decades ago. The current guidance, following updated Resuscitation Council UK guidelines, has moved away from the older DRABC approach a lot of people over a certain age will remember from school: danger, response, airway, breathing, circulation. The streamlined version taught now for lay rescuers is simpler and built around 3 core steps. Check for danger and only approach if the area is genuinely safe. If the person is unresponsive, call 999 immediately and specifically ask for an AED if one's available nearby. If they're unresponsive and not breathing normally, start CPR immediately. Don't wait for the ambulance to arrive before beginning. The specific technical details worth knowing, and genuinely worth remembering rather than just passing a test on, cover exact hand placement and compression depth. Compressions should be delivered to a depth of 5 to 6 centimeters on an adult casualty, at a rate of somewhere between 100 and 120 compressions per minute. If that number means nothing to you in the abstract, it roughly matches the tempo of the song "Staying Alive" by the Bee Gees, a piece of advice that's become genuinely standard across first aid training, precisely because it gives people an instinctive, memorable rhythm to work from, in a situation where panic makes it very easy to either rush or slow down without realizing. AED use is the genuinely new territory here, since it's never featured in the theory test before this change. The core message worth understanding is that these devices are built to be used by untrained members of the public, not just paramedics or trained first aiders. Once switched on, an AED talks you through every single step out loud, checking the rhythm of the person's heart automatically, and only delivering a shock if the device itself determines one is actually needed. You genuinely cannot misuse a functioning AED in a way that harms someone who doesn't need a shock. The device simply won't deliver one if it doesn't detect a shockable rhythm. That single fact removes the single biggest psychological barrier that stops people attempting to use one. the fear of somehow making things worse through their own inexperience. It's worth understanding the timeline here properly too, because there's been a fair amount of inconsistent reporting about exactly when this landed. The DVSA first announced this change back in August last year, giving learners a genuine run-up period to start familiarizing themselves with the new content well before it actually appeared in live tests. Updated official DVSA learning materials, including the official app and revision guides, were updated well ahead of the actual rollout, specifically so nobody sitting a test from early this year onward would be caught out by content they'd never seen referenced anywhere in their preparation. If you're currently learning to drive and haven't sat your theory test yet, here's the practical takeaway worth acting on rather than just nodding along to. Make sure whatever revision materials or app you're using have actually been updated to include this content, since older, unofficial third-party question banks that haven't been refreshed may not reflect what's genuinely being asked now. The official DVSA app and the gov.uk theory test materials are the safest place to check you're studying the current version, rather than content that predates this change. There's a broader point worth making here that goes beyond simply passing a test, because that's really the entire spirit behind why the DVSA pushed for this change in the first place. Knowing this information only actually matters if you genuinely act on it in the moment. And there's a meaningful difference between having answered a multiple-choice question correctly months or years ago and having the confidence to actually step in during a real emergency. If you've got even a few minutes, looking up a free CPR and AED guide through Resuscitation Council UK or one of the Save a Life programs running across Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland is worth doing, regardless of whether you're currently studying for your theory test or passed it 20 years ago, long before any of this content existed. It's worth mentioning that this isn't the only structural change hitting the driving test process around the same period, even though the theory test content is the one we're focused on here specifically. Separately, and entirely unconnected to the first aid content, the practical test booking system has gone through its own set of changes this year, tightening how many times a booking can be altered and who's actually allowed to make those changes. None of that affects the theory test itself, which continues to run through its own separate booking system with its own separate rules. But if you're navigating the whole process for the first time, it's worth knowing the theory and practical tests now sit under genuinely different sets of restrictions that didn't used to be quite so distinct from each other. There's also a wider question worth asking about where this content goes next, because the DVSA has indicated the car and motorcycle theory tests were specifically chosen as the starting point, rather than the end point. Other test types are expected to incorporate similar content at a later stage, following the same underlying reasoning, that a structured, high-volume touchpoint like a mandatory test is one of the most efficient ways to spread genuinely life-saving knowledge across a huge cross-section of the population who might otherwise never seek out formal first aid training on their own initiative. It's worth understanding a bit more about why cardiac arrest survival rates in this country have historically sat as low as they have, because it helps explain why the DVSA specifically targeted this gap, rather than any number of other health topics it could theoretically have chosen. Survival depends enormously on speed. Every single minute that passes without CPR or defibrillation after a cardiac arrest reduces the chances of survival by roughly 10%, according to figures widely cited by resuscitation charities. An ambulance responding to a genuinely urgent call can easily take 8 to 10 minutes to arrive in many parts of the country, sometimes longer in rural areas, which means the person physically present in those first critical minutes, often a bystander with no medical training at all, genuinely determines the outcome far more than anything the ambulance crew does once they finally arrive. That's the entire logic behind targeting drivers specifically through a test nearly every adult in the country eventually sits. It puts baseline knowledge into a genuinely enormous number of people who are statistically very likely to be exactly that bystander at some point in their lives. It's also worth flagging where you'd actually encounter an AED if you needed one, since knowing the theory means little if you wouldn't recognize where to look in the moment. Public defibrillators are increasingly common in train stations, shopping centers, gyms, workplaces, and community buildings, usually housed in a bright green or yellow cabinet, sometimes secured with a code obtained by calling the emergency services operator during the 999 call itself. Apps and online maps run by ambulance trusts and organizations like the British Heart Foundation let you search for the nearest registered public AED to any location, which is worth having installed on your phone before an emergency happens, rather than trying to find it for the first time in the middle of one. So let's bring this together into something you can actually use, whether you're currently learning to drive, or you passed your test long before any of this existed. If you're studying for your theory test now, confirm your revision materials specifically include the updated CPR and AED content, using the official DVSA app or gov.uk resources, rather than assuming an older question bank has kept pace with the change. Remember the core sequence: check for danger, call 999, and ask for an AED if the person's unresponsive, and start CPR immediately without waiting if they're not breathing normally. Keep the 5 to 6 centimeter compression depth and the staying alive tempo in mind as practical anchors rather than abstract numbers. And regardless of when you passed your own test, remember that a functioning AED is built specifically to be safely used by someone with zero prior training, which is exactly the barrier this entire change is designed to remove. None of this is designed to suggest every driver needs to become a qualified first responder overnight. The entire point of building this into a test that 2.4 million people sit every year is that basic, correctly remembered knowledge, applied confidently in the first few critical minutes before professional help arrives, is genuinely one of the biggest factors in whether someone survives a cardiac arrest at all. It's worth ending on a practical note about what actually happens once emergency services arrive, because a lot of people hesitate to start CPR, partly out of a vague worry about somehow interfering with what paramedics will do when they get there. In reality, continuing CPR right up until a paramedic physically takes over from you is exactly what's expected. And ambulance control operators taking your 999 call will typically talk you through the process in real time over the phone if you're at all unsure, counting compressions out loud with you and answering questions as they come up. You're never expected to handle this entirely alone or from memory under pressure. The call handler is there specifically to support you through it, which is worth remembering if the idea of relying purely on theory test knowledge in an actual emergency feels daunting. If this helped you understand exactly what's changed and why it matters, well beyond simply passing a test, hit subscribe, because I'll keep covering the driving test and licensing changes that genuinely matter, not just the ones that make for an easy headline. This particular update is one of the rare ones where the underlying content is worth remembering for its own sake entirely, regardless of whether you've got a test booked or passed yours decades ago. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.